making everything.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Mara Kaktins. She is the leading authority in archaeological analysis of colonial ceramics and glassware. She's been doing archaeology for nearly 20 years and receiving a BA from the University of Pittsburgh and an MA from Temple University, where she studied under the mentorship of George Miller, the foremost material culturalist in the field. Mara oversees, among other things, mending projects to determine what table and teawares would have adorned the Washington family table and china cabinets. Her research informs what 18th century and glass are on display at Kenmore, and what reproduction ceramics and glass are in the Washington House. And so, with no further ado, Mara Kaktins.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
If at any point anybody has any questions, please ask. We're going to do this pretty informally. And if you can't hear me at any point, just do this and I'll speak up. I don't like microphones because I tend to pace a little bit in front of the screen. So who's ready to talk about 18th century beverages? Right? Okay. First I'm going to have to give you a little bit of a background, and I'm sorry, I heard a request for samples. I don't have any on me, but I encourage anybody afterwards to go out and get yourself a cocktail. So a little bit of background on Ferry Farm. I'm sure most of you are very informed of what I'm speaking of, but I have to do this. So Ferry Farm is George Washington's boyhood home, of course. It's just across the river. And George was 6 whenever the family moved there in 1738. And I do have notes because I never remember these dates. It's terrible. I've been working here for 7 years. And the reason why they moved there is so that his father, Augustine, could be closer to his iron furnace, which is a property that he managed. By 1743, Augustine has died, and Washington's future is a little bit more chaotic now. It's a little bit less certain. So, but his mother, Mary, decides to continue on and not remarry. And this is kind of a big deal because she's an 18th century widow, she's got property, she's pretty eligible. But she decides to stay single. And the reason why she probably does that is so that all of her children can have their inheritance. If she remarried, it would have gone to her new husband. So she's striking out on her own and successfully raises 5 children to adulthood, which is a pretty big deal in the 18th century. So a lot of the story at Ferry Farm is about Mary. Of course, George is her bread and butter. We love George. But really, Mary's the one that's staying there until 1772. George leaves when he's about 22 in 1755. But all of the artifacts that I'm going to be showing you from Ferry Farm, they pretty much belong to Mary. This is Mary's decision what she's buying, what she's deciding to put on her table, and it's very deliberate, which is one thing that I'm going to be emphasizing over and over and over again. So, excavations have been going on at Ferry Farm since the 90s, right? Yes. But really in earnest in the early 2000s is whenever things really got going. The foundation for the house was found in 2008. This is the cellar right here. The majority of the artifacts that I'm going to be showing you were excavated from this cellar. And the reason why it doesn't look completely rectangular is because this part has been left unexcavated, and still is. And the reproduction house, you haven't seen it, sits directly on top of the foundation. Well, it hovers above it. It's not quite sitting on top of it. So my job as the ceramics and glass analyst is basically take all the pieces that have been recovered from the field and get information out of them. And the way I do that is by mending studies. So I apologize for the quality of this photo. It was taken with my cell phone about 4 hours ago. And this is what you would see if you came into the lab. These are the porcelains that belong to the Washington family. And we laid them all out so we can figure out what vessels we've got. Because that's really the starting point. It's not just about excavating the sherds, it's about putting them together and finding information. So this is basically if you took about 200 puzzles, mixed all the pieces together, threw away 90% of them in the box lids, and then tried to figure out what you were looking at. Fortunately, I have an amazing staff that is really good at puzzles. So each one of these little piles represents a discrete porcelain vessel. All the way back there. And we're trying to figure out just what types of teawares Mary had on her table and in her cabinets. And this is an ongoing study, but we should be wrapping it up by the end of the year. So a lot of the vessels that I'm going to be showing you are porcelain because we're really excited about this study right now, and it's in the forefront of my mind. So ultimately, what happens with the information that we generate is it goes directly into the reproduced Washington house. And so the archaeology is informing what vessels, ceramics, and glass, table and teawares, are getting put in the house. So we can say, okay, Mary's got this type of porcelain with this type of design, make it happen. And the curators back there, make it happen, shout out. All right. So, why are these porcelains so important? Why are all these ceramics and glass so important? Because just like today in the 18th century, especially with beverages, you are what you drink. And drinking is a social status thing. It's very visible, it's conspicuous consumption, so I'm going to be emphasizing that over and over again. And this should be nothing new to folks today because this is just a tiny amount of the advertisements that you'll see that we're bombarded with every day that teach us that our identity is linked with what we consume. And this seems to be especially true with beverages. So whether or not you want to be an everyday working class Joe, you want to be a party animal, you want to be sophisticated and elite, do you want to be an adventurer with passion? You can have a beverage, be it kombucha or alcohol or water. Even our bottled water is ranked in terms of who are you, what water are you drinking? So the same thing applies in the 18th century, and there's actually a lot of pressure to be drinking the right things. So that being said, I'm going to launch into the non-alcoholic stuff first, get that out of the way. Probably the most elite beverage, the non-alcoholic variety, is tea. So tea, as many of you probably already know, there's been a lot said about the tea ceremony in the 18th century. This is like an elaborate dance that they would be involved in. And it was very heavily involving women. So this teaspoon belonged to Betty Washington, George's sister. And this is just an example of how she was being groomed to properly make tea, serve tea, and consume tea. So this teaspoon right here is an example of the equipage that you needed in order to properly serve tea. Don't get me wrong, everybody in the 18th century was drinking tea, from the poorest of the poor to the richest of the rich. I did an excavation of an almshouse privy that I was telling you guys about, dates to 1732 to 1767. In their logs, they're talking about how they issued inmates one serving of tea a day because it would be absolutely barbaric to not serve them tea. So everybody's drinking tea. It's just a matter of how you're drinking the tea. And this is where it gets complicated. So Betty's being groomed to drink tea, to serve tea, to be a part of this whole tea ceremony. So she's got this teaspoon with her initials on it. This is not a really fancy teaspoon. This is pewter. This is basically a starter kit. This is how you start learning how to do the tea ceremony. Whenever she gets older, she's going to graduate to silver, probably after she's married. So this is the beginning of that. And equipage is very important with the tea ceremony. You can just be brewing tea in a regular old pot and drinking it out of any old mug. Or you can be putting your tea in a canister like this. So these are some of the sherds that I was showing you on the table. This is Chinese export porcelain, which is basically the most expensive fancy stuff Mary could get her hands on. It's painted over the glaze, so you can see some of it sort of rubbing off here. This is probably a chinoiserie landscape. We call it the pom-pom tree. That's not what it is. That's just, we made that up. And so it's a tea canister. So this shows that she's storing her teas in a highly visible way that's very elite. It's all about the image. And she's got some pretty nice porcelain teawares. So this is also Chinese export porcelain. Almost all the porcelain we have is from China, which, like I said, is the best stuff. We've been looking specifically at the overglaze painted porcelain. So this is all one vessel. This is all one saucer. I know it doesn't look like it, but this is also a lesson in post-depositional processes. These two shards were buried together in a different place than these guys over here. And these ones had a much better home after they broke. They look a lot better. Really fine detail in this painting. Probably the brush for this design was one hair. That's it, one boar hair or one horse hair. And it's really hard to find brushes like that nowadays because we've been trying to reproduce it. And then there's a lot of gilding right here. So this is what it would have looked like. Very nice stuff. Also what we're finding is that we have saucers that match cups, which shouldn't seem like much of a surprise to you guys today, but actually that's kind of a big deal because teawares and tablewares were bought piecemeal. She wouldn't order a whole set. Those didn't exist during Mary Washington's time at Ferry Farm. We all probably have dinner sets. The plates look like the saucers, look like the bowls, look like the cups. This is not a reality in Mary's world. It's totally different. So you buy these really nice pieces, but they don't necessarily match each other. So we know we can match the saucers and cups, but we don't have two cups that match each other at Archaeologically. And she has some pretty nice stuff. This is another example of, I mean, these shirts, this one's the size of a dime. And again, one tiny little hair right here. It would have been filled in with green, but the green doesn't survive very well. It's painted over the glaze, it wipes off pretty easily. But this is what that nice little teacup would have looked like. That tiny little design right there. So again, she's putting forth this really nice stuff that she's got. Now that being said, whenever we did the mending study, honestly, she didn't have as much porcelain as perhaps some other people in the gentry class. She's sort of the lower end of the gentry class, but she's trying to work her way up. So that's what these porcelain pieces are. Most of her teawares are not porcelain. This is the only English porcelain example we have. And these shards represent a teacup. Again, it's hand painted under the glaze. It's kind of surprising that she doesn't have more English porcelain, but for some reason we're not finding it here archaeologically. That could be either it didn't break at Ferry Farm, or she didn't like it, or the merchants that she was dealing with didn't have those kinds of connections. All right, this is one of the wackier pieces. Some of you might be familiar with vegetable ware. If you can make vegetable teaware, why not? This is sort of a flash-in-the-pan fad in the colonial era. Vegetable ware is developed by Josiah Wedgwood. He develops this really nice green glaze, and it just pops, and everybody likes it. And he decides, everybody likes this green glaze, I'm going to make vegetables. And in addition to cauliflower and pineapple, there's melons, and it's wacky. And it only lasts about 10 years. And during the colonial period, 10 years is a flash in the pan. Like, that's nothing. And actually, in the colonies, it lasts from about 1760 to 1780. Not because it was necessarily that fashionable, but because English potters were like, I got all this vegetableware that I need to unload. Nobody in England is buying it. I'm going to ship it over to the colonies, so why not? So we end up with more vegetableware than England because of that. But this is a tea canister. These tiny little fragments right here. We don't have any other fragments of vegetableware except for these pieces. So this means that she probably only had one piece. She was buying things piecemeal. So when you think of her table setting for teawares, it's got a lot of different wear types, a lot of different colors, a lot of different patterns and motifs. You know, it's not what we would think of today as being aesthetically pleasing. But she does have a lot of teawares. Yes?
You had talked about the tea ceremony that these would be used at. Can you say anything about the tea ceremony?
So, the tea would have to be brewed in a little pot, and the women would serve the men. You would have a tiny amount of tea. The tea would be stored in the canisters, and basically the women would serve the men first, and then they would sit down and tea themselves, and they would all enjoy it. One of the weird things about drinking tea in the 18th century is that if the tea was too hot, they would actually pour it into the saucer and slurp out of the saucer, which to us seems pretty uncouth. But this actually extends well into the 20th century, especially in some rural parts of Virginia. So you would be sipping the tea like that, and then there's loose tea leaves. It's not in a nice little packet. So whenever you were done, towards the end, in your teacup, there would be tea leaves. So you'd have a slop bowl, and you pour the tea into a slop bowl. We have several slop bowls too. They're just look like larger teacups, essentially. And you would have, you know, the right amount of sugar and things like that would be chipped off in large blocks. And it's a very delicate process, we'll just put it that way, with genteel conversation and, you know, not too light, not too involved, just sort of like something to just enjoy. But also at the same time, this is how women would meet their husbands. So this is kind of a big deal for women to be able to show that they have this level of refinement. And there's no way they're going to know that unless they participated in it over and over and over again. I hope that answers your question. So here's another bit of teaware wackiness. We call her the melty face. She's mildly horrific, depending on your outlook. And this is called Wielden or clouded or tortoise ware. And this is another example of just the varied teawares that she had. This is a refined earthenware, and she is the top of a foot. It would have been a tripod teapot, and the face would be right here. So this represents that, and I swear to God the potter meant to do this. This is intentional. It's, you know, it's not a mistake. People look at it and they're like, why would you make it look like that? Well, natural forms were very popular in the middle of the 18th century. As the century progresses, wider, more succinct, refined wares start coming into popularity. So this represents that. So when you think of Mary's tea table, think of something more like this. This is an early 17th century, or early 18th century Dutch painting. And you've got a silver pewter vessel, a refined, actually this is probably Staffordshire right here, a stoneware teapot from China, a Delft tea canister, and 2 porcelain teacups. So that's what we're dealing with. But it's amazing how many different teawares Mary has. She has over a dozen teaware motifs in porcelain alone, and probably a couple dozen in other ware types like stoneware and creamware and such. So she's definitely portraying this air of refinement throughout, you know, the tea ceremony. And from there, we're going to transition into chocolate. So, has anybody here had an 18th century version of hot chocolate? It's way better than Swiss Miss. It's not put out of the pot. It's downright decadent. And also what's decadent is having porcelain that you can drink chocolate or coffee out of separate from your teawares. Can you make chocolate in a teapot and serve it out of a teacup? Yes, you absolutely can. There's nothing wrong with that. It'll taste exactly the same, but that's not the point. The point is to drink it out of something different and to have people see you drinking it and to serve it in a vessel like this. So the way a tea or a coffee cup, or a chocolate or a coffee cup looks different from a teacup is that it tends to be more straight-sided, and a lot of times they have handles. And we actually, this is one of our coffee or chocolate cups. We have 2 of the same motif, so that's interesting. I don't know if I told you that, Dave. We have 2 of the same motif, so yay. It's also important, just like tea, to have the right equipage. Now, we do not have any evidence archaeologically of chocolate pots, but this is the sort of pot that you would brew your chocolate drink in. And you would have a special stirring device, which is meant for mixing up this kind of chunky 18th century chocolate. I'm not putting it down. It's really good, but it does have bits in it. And the ingredients are quite a bit different. To put it in perspective, chocolate was discovered at least 3,000 years ago in South America, introduced by the Aztecs to the Spanish, and they ran with it. And a chocolate drink in the 18th century would be sugar, cream, either chocolate nibs, or grated dark chocolate, think baking chocolate, like not sweet at all, just pure cocoa. In addition to that, you could add some chili powder, you could add spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, and mix it all together. And sometimes nuts, although I think that's going a bit too far, personally. So we also have documentary evidence of the Washingtons purchasing chocolate. We have George Washington buying 20 pounds of chocolate in 1757, maybe was for that. And this is Betty Washington's receipt from, I think, 1790. She's buying a gallon of chocolate. It's kind of hard to read. And she probably means chocolate nibs, I would think, because there's no such thing as Hershey's chocolate syrup. And I'll be grateful for that. So yeah, chocolate is a big deal. All right, where am I? All right. Cider. Now getting into the fun stuff. We're going to start low. Cider is probably the most important colonial beverage. We think beer was probably what was consumed most by colonists day in and day out. That's only because of the way we elevated beer. We drink a lot more beer than we drink cider, so we think, oh, they drank a lot of beer. Well, they did. They drank more than we do today. But as much beer as they drank, they also drank even more cider. The reason why cider is so important is because fruit trees grow really well here. So colonists brought fruit trees over. They established themselves well. In fact, sometimes if you needed to, say, legalize a land grant, the provision was you plant fruit trees. So you have to show that you're going to improve the land. So a lot of times it was apple. Apple grew great. Not our own apples. Crab apples are the only native apples here. And they do not make good cider. My family pickles them. That's also a little bit weird. So people were making cider, a lot of cider. And everybody was drinking cider, from the very poor to the very rich, the very young to the very old. Children were drinking cider all day long. It's a low alcohol cider, probably around 3% alcohol, but it's more safe to drink than water. So everybody's drinking it.
Why was it bad to eat apples?
Oh, that's just Ben Franklin.
Okay.
And he was a famous imbiber. He wanted moderation in other areas, but not when it came to drinking. All right. Okay. So, another reason why cider was so important is because it was a way to preserve an apple crop. So food preservation was huge in the 18th century. And if you couldn't keep it for a long time, turn it into alcohol, save for grains and things like that. And cider is ridiculously easy to turn into alcohol. It does not require much effort at all. You just have to make apple juice and put it in a cask and let it go. I personally have made cider super duper easy. You could add things like yeast, you could add a clarifier, you could add a little bit of extra sugar and molasses. You didn't need to. And if it went too far in the fermentation process, it became vinegar, which they also needed. So it was basically a win-win. So, what are the types of drinking vessels that cider would have been consumed out of? These are also from Ferry Farm, of course. So, this is our fragment of a Bartman krug. It's a German stoneware, and I'll get into a little bit more why German stonewares are showing up at Ferry Farm and other places in the colony. But the Germans called it Bartman, and that meant man who lives in the woods, essentially. So the Germans are making this stoneware since about 1500 to the 1770s. So this ware type and vessel form goes on for a really long time. And it's a bottle that would have held ales, ciders, low alcohol content. And you could decant with it, or you could drink directly out of it, whatever was your preference. The Old Man of the Woods was a big fixture of German folklore. Whenever they exported it to England and the colonies, they're like, well, we don't know anything about German folklore, but we think it looks like Cardinal Bellarmine. So you may have heard them called Bellarmines. That's the English name for them. Because the English didn't like Bellarmine. He was a Catholic cardinal, and they thought this was a depiction mocking him. He was anti-Protestant. Most of the people in the colonies were Protestants and considered themselves English citizens, so they called them Bellarmines. But either way, they're really cool. In addition to that, we have evidence of lots of tankards and mugs and jugs and things like that, and that's what ciders and ales would have been consumed out of in the 18th century. Now, these are also German. The reason why the colonies are getting a lot of German stoneware, so the rule is we're in an English colony. We buy our goods from England. So they're getting some ceramics from China, porcelain, they're making a lot of English ceramics and importing it to us. We're not allowed to trade with other countries, but we're getting German stonewares because the Hanover line, George I, II, and III, they're German kings. So that opens up trade with Germany. So the colonies get flooded with German stoneware. And a lot of times it has emblems on it that represent the English crown. So these two fragments have the lion for the king. And then this, I know it's hard to picture, but I'll show you a complete vessel in a bit, has GR on it, which means George Rex, King George. And this one probably represents the third King George. Here's another interesting example that we have at Ferry Farm. This would have been a mug, again, for cider or ale. And you can clearly see the GR. This is not German stoneware, this is English stoneware. So this is what happens whenever the English copy German stoneware. And we call it debased because it's kind of a degraded version. So I'll show you German, English. So the English is a little bit, you know, not as crisp, not as nice. So this vessel right here was excavated from Kenmore, Betty Washington's house with her husband Fielding Lewis. And this is kind of interesting because Kenmore was built towards the end of the Revolution. And the Lewis family, they were huge supporters of the war effort. They were enemies of the crown. And they've got this mug that's celebrating King George. So it's a little bit problematic. It's like, hey, why have you got this mug? You're, you know, a huge supporter of the war. So we don't really know. We like to think that maybe some drunken night they're drinking their cider and decide to ceremoniously smash the mug on the ground, you know, in a loyalty to the colonies. Or maybe they're just like, meh, it's a mug. It holds liquid. We'll keep it around. Why not? So basically, we'll never know, and the relationship status is complicated. Great. So let's move on then to one of my favorites, wine. This is not wine, I swear it's tea. I swear. So we have about 75 years worth of wine bottles that belong to the Washington family. They weren't there for 75 years, but we've got 75 years worth of wine bottles. And the reason is that wine bottles were reused. So this guy right here, this is the earliest wine bottle that we have. This is first quarter of the 18th century. It's round. We call them onion bottles. As time progresses, this is second quarter of the 18th century. The sides are a little bit straighter. It's starting to resemble something that looks a little bit more like we would think of as a wine bottle. And then this is third quarter of the 18th century. And it looks almost like a wine bottle does today. People can picture it. Whenever I show them this, they're like, yeah, I don't know what that is. And also, you'll probably notice this weird substance on the exterior of the vessels. So this is called glass thickness or patination. So this is what happens whenever the bottle sits in the ground for a very long time. The minerals and metals that are inherent to glass wine bottles leaches out and it gets deposited on the outside. In fact, if I were to put this in your hand, little flakes of it would come off. These bottles aren't so thick, patinated, whatever you would call it, that they're unstable, but the British Museum, for instance, right, has problems with glass degrading, so much so that you can just snap it like a page. So that's glass thickness. And both of these vessels were recovered from the first kitchen fire that happened in the 1740s or 1750s. So this one's a little bit warped from the fire. It's melted slightly. But this just shows basically 50 years worth of wine bottles in one kitchen because they're reusing these bottles a lot. Which brings me to my next point. They're not really wine bottles. Not really. They held wine sometimes, but not always. They were all-purpose bottles. Think of them as this, or a Nalgene bottle, or something like that. You could put whatever you want in it, and they did. So what they would do when they were finished with the bottle is they would put some sand or gravel in it, and shake it around, scour it out, and fill it with something else. Usually this would be a high-octane alcohol, wine, gin, whiskey, rum, etc. but it could really be anything. Sometimes they used lead shot to scour out the inside, which is a terrible idea. You should never do that. Especially because if I can flip these bottles over, you can see there's a really high kick up right here in each of them. And that was so when the glass blower blew it, push up the base so it's stable, so it doesn't wobble on the table. And sometimes the lead shot would get stuck between the kick up and the wall of the wine vessel, and wine is acidic, and you know how that's going to turn out. But they had so much lead in their systems anyway, it doesn't probably matter. All right. I'm going to get into the types of wines. We'll get back to wines. Let's just say they're wine bottles and they only held wine. We'll talk about wine for a little bit. The type of wine that they would have held, if they held wine, which they didn't, would be fortified wines. So we're talking about sherries, Madeiras, ports. And the reason for that is, I mean, they would have drank more Burgundies if they had had a chance, but that wine did not make it over from England very well. So England would buy wine from Madeira and Portugal that had been fortified. This way it would survive the voyage. So you put a Burgundy in a ship, in the bottom of the ship, where it's wet and it's humid, and it's either hot or really cold, and it's getting jostled around. By the time you get to Virginia, it's vinegar, which that's useful too, but you really wanted wine instead. So the fortified wine, when you add brandy to wine, it stops the fermentation process. And this means the wine's done. It's not going to ferment anymore. It's not going to get any worse. And actually, fermented 90% probably wasn't that great. So fortified wine also really likes abuse. It's like the masochist of the wines. It likes being jostled. It likes being too hot. It likes being too cold. It likes being too humid. You can't hurt it enough, really. And it likes being in bottles rather than casks. You could buy casks, but it really aged better in bottles. And what they would do is put it in the bottom of ships as ballast, basically. It wasn't really worth that much. And just to weigh down the ship, and then they get to the colonies and unload it. Now, some people would buy big casks and then immediately decant it into bottles. And they didn't store it in a cellar. They'd store it in the portico or in the attic. They wanted it to get really cold, really hot, and just be horribly abused. In fact, the best ports and Madeiras were the ones that left England and traveled south of the equator and then back up. In fact, the journey of the wine would be documented on the label if it had a really long journey. So you would say, all right, this is Sirchel, Madeira. It traveled to Bermuda and then to Charleston and then to Richmond. And that would mean that it was worth more. And it stores for a really long time. How long? I found this on the internet just today. It's a 1715 bottle of Madeira. It sold last week for an undisclosed price, of course. And it had been tasted by an expert who declared it absolutely delicious. So I've had old port, like 50-year-old port. It's really good. I can't imagine 300-year-old Madeira, but I give it a shot, you know, 100%. So let's get back to our wine bottles. We have some personalized wine bottles at Ferry Farm. And you know how you go to somebody's house for a party, you bring a bottle of wine, the same thing applies during the Washington time, except for some of the wine bottles had a personalized seal on them. If you were really well-to-do, and I don't think we have any Washington family seals, so they weren't quite up there yet. But if you were really well-to-do, you had your seal put on the wine bottle, and again, anything could have been in it. So this one says, has an I, which could mean an I or a J, they're interchangeable during that time, and then bin. So it might be the Corbin family, an old Virginia family that had ties to the Washington, so they could have come for a party, brought a bottle of wine, and for that reason, wine bottle seals tend to hop around the landscape. I told you about the almshouse that I excavated. We recovered a John Pole 1751 seal from that privy. And no, they were not drinking fine wine in the almshouse, but he was a donor of the almshouse. So he gave them a bottle, or maybe multiple bottles, and that seal ended up in the excavation. And then this one's kind of weird. This isn't normal. You don't usually etch a name on a wine bottle. It takes a lot of, I couldn't do this. I don't know, my handwriting doesn't look that good even when I'm using a pen and paper, let alone writing on glass. So this says Joseph, 1740. Come on, I really want that last number. I think maybe this was Joseph Ball, Mary Washington's brother, who was heavily involved in the Washington family. He may have had it sent over. Who inscribed this on the bottle? Why? Not really sure. Like I said, it's unusual. Okay, getting on to how the wine would have been consumed. The Washingtons definitely had a lot of stemware. We have so far recovered at least 12 wine glasses from the excavations that belong to the Washingtons, and 12 different styles. No two are the same. Now, as I said, sets aren't a thing, but you would still order a dozen wine glasses that were similar in motif. So this means that we're looking at a lot more wine glasses that existed other than what we're finding archaeologically. And this is just one of the more complete examples, and it would have looked a lot like this guy right here. In addition to that, super fancy. So this is kind of crazy. This is not something I would expect to find. This is more like Fairfax level wine equipage. This tiny little fragment, and you're just going to have to trust me because I know it doesn't look like much. This is Venetian glass, and one of the reasons why I know that is because it's unleaded and it's incredibly delicate glass. Leaded glass is what the English were mostly producing, and it's extremely adequate. There's nothing wrong with leaded glass. It has fantastic clarity to it. However, adding the lead makes the viscosity more thick, so you can't do as delicate a design with them. The Venetians said, we can make nice clear glass and not add lead, and then we can make these beautiful goblets and vases. So this little piece right here, non-leaded, it has a bead of opaque glass running up the center, which is not easy to do. And this is called a buttressed and pincer design. So basically they took little tongs and pinched bits of glass off of it while it's heated, and then this is the buttressing right here. And what we're looking at is a tiny piece of the handle from something super duper fancy. This is probably a display piece. I really don't think that this was utilized on a regular basis. I wouldn't want to drink wine out of it. I would just want to look at it. And I think the reason why we're not finding more pieces of this is because if this little chunk got knocked off of your Venetian goblet, you'd probably keep it. You wouldn't, say, oh, well, it's broken. This may have also been an heirloom piece, because some of these examples date, well, like in early 17th century. The Venetians were really good at what they did. So, in addition to the nice clear glass, a lot of people who come to Ferry Farm are surprised to learn that there's a lot of colorful glass on the Washington's table. And this is, again, the norm. We think of Arnoni's table glass as being clear, usually leaded. That's, again, not the case. Lots of colors. Colors are good, patterns are good, textures are good. So we have amethyst glass that probably went to a goblet like this. And then, again, you're going to have to trust me, this is a tiny, tiny little fragment of the lip of a wine rinser. And this is actually smoky quartz colored glass. And again, wine can be consumed by anybody, but if you're in the gentry level, you're going to be having a lot of different wine equipage. So, for instance, a rinser, I'm from Western Pennsylvania, we say rins, I'm sorry. So this would have been used to clean out your wine glass in between courses of wine, but then also to chill your wine glass if necessary. There were also these things called montiques that were really big. You could put maybe 12 glasses in, so everybody at the party is drinking and rinsing out their glass, which is disgusting. But it was a very expensive piece of equipment to go along with drinking wine. It demonstrated refinement. So, now I'm going to move on to some of the mixed drinks. Starting with Syllabub. Shout out, Heather, for this. I stole all my Syllabub research from her. So this is a wine, well, it's a stemware base from a squat cup. Squat stemware. It was probably a cup that would serve a dessert drink such as Syllabub. And if you've never heard of Syllabub, it was first mentioned in the the 1600s, and it was kind of, well, it involves milk and alcohol, which is a little bit weird. But they would mix milk and alcohol, and it would curdle the milk, and it would cause it to separate. And I see you wincing, yeah, it's probably the right response to that. And I think the first recipe that Heather found was one where the milkmaid actually squirted milk from the udder directly into a bowl full of alcohol and sugar. And that is just so impractical and also so unsanitary. My family had a dairy farm I would not put anything under that. So, anyway, logistics aside. So here we have an example of a shirt of a possible Syllabub cup. And this is definitely a beverage that the Washingtons would have been drinking and serving for special occasions. They wouldn't drink this, you know, just hanging out around the house. This is something that would be a dessert beverage when people came to visit. And again, special glasses to go with special drinks. And to give you an idea of how it would be served up, Heather and Megan back there are curators. They put this display together. The Syllabub would go on these little salvers, these trays, and it would be displayed. It wasn't just, here, drink this is super expensive to make. It was also, look at how beautiful this is. And because we are consummate researchers with the foundation, we made our own Syllabub and gave it a shot. And it turns out it's delicious, actually. Or at least this 18th century version of it is delicious. So as Syllabub evolves as a drink, it becomes a little bit more refined. And this delicious beverage, Heather, that was just so good. I wish I was drinking some right now. Is a mixture of white wine, heavy whipping cream, sugar, lemon juice, lemon zest, and spices, and then it's whipped all up. And what you end up with is an alcoholic whipped cream, which you can spoon and eat, or let it separate and drink it. But I'd rather eat it as a delicious, floofy thing. And towards the end of the 18th century, this is how it would have been served, as just a topping on other desserts. And, you know, despite our reservations with mixing dairy and alcohol, I can assure you it is pretty good. All right, now we're going to move on to one of my favorite 18th century cocktails, Flip. Flip is another odd mixture of ale, usually whiskey or rum, spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice. You mix that all together, and then in that whole mess, you crack a raw egg. And then the flip is when you take two tumblers like that and go back and forth. Now, if you look up Flip Cup on the internet nowadays, you're going to get a red Solo cup. But I swear this is the original Flip Cup. And so you mix it back and forth until it's nice and uniformly mixed up, and then in that whole mess, you take a red hot poker from the fire and put it in there. This does not cook the egg, you wish. It just makes it a little bit warm. So you've got this warm, eggy, boozy beer mixture. And I have tried it, because again, I'm a very good researcher. And Rebecca made a Flip once, and it did have egg whites in it. It was pretty good. They didn't heat it up, though. So it's kind of like the original eggnog. And it was traditionally served out of these tumblers. So these are two archaeological examples that we have at Ferry Farm. They're copper wheel engraved, which means they've got this nice little etching on them. And this is kind of odd about Ferry Farm. We found almost a dozen of them in the excavation. I've probably found 2 shirts of copper engraved flip cups in the 12 years of doing archaeology before I came to Ferry Farm. So they've got a lot of flip cups for some reason. And almost all of them have the exact same motif, which is pretty common. This is an original 18th century example. So it's got this oval with cross-hatching inside and then a wavy band. And I'm not saying that Flip was the only thing that was served out of these tumblers. You could drink anything out of them, but I'm saying if you were going to make Flip, you would serve it out of something like this. So I think that's a very good argument if they have almost a dozen of them that they're serving this beverage to people whenever they come to visit. Because again, this isn't an everyday, end of the day type beverage. This takes a little bit of effort to make. And just to promote the Washington House, we've actually been experimenting with making our own reproductions. So this example is one that we made with a cup that we bought at a Goodwill and a drum in the lab. So we're now the Archaeology and Forgeries Department. And if you want to come see our forgeries, the house is now full of them. In addition to reproducing the flip cups, we have made Bohemian milk glass tumblers. So this is a fragment of one of 4 hand-painted Bohemian tumblers. Painted milk glass is, again, not usual archaeologically. I only found 1 shirt before coming to Ferry Farm. We have at least 4 tumblers that I've identified. And you can see the paint comes off very easily. It's hard to see. But we did see a similar cross-hatching motif, so we decided to reproduce this. This was a tumbler, the motif is from a tumbler that we found in the British Museum, and so we repainted it using just acrylics that we bought at a craft store. So we have these in the house too. And these are all-purpose tumblers. Some sort of a cocktail would be consumed out of them. Not wine, not beer, something a little bit more refined. And like I said, they're unusual. It's weird that we find them at Ferry Farm. Now I'm going to end with my favorite colonial beverage, and that would be punch. And I'm not talking 7-Up and sherbet. I am talking lots of hard alcohol, usually rum or whiskey, tiny little bit of water, just a bit, mind you. Some spices again, nutmeg, allspice, cinnamon, clove, citrus juice, and sugar. All these ingredients are very expensive. This is an elite drink. Only people that have money are drinking this. To put it in perspective, I saw an invoice the other day, and it was a tab for a man that had bought a large bowl of punch from a local tavern, and it cost what was then the average monthly income for a man at the time. So 1 month's income buys you a bowl of punch. 2 months' income gets you an engagement ring. So that's putting it relatively speaking. So everything that went into punch was super expensive. There were also thousands of different punch recipes. Some of them also involved milk. But the 5 basic ingredients were hard liquor, water, citrus juice, spices, and sugar. And very conspicuous consumption. You can see these gentlemen right here are very proud of the fact that they've got a big punch bowl in the front. This is prominent. And they're also showing off their legs and their beautiful buckles and their extremely long pipes. And you can see this enslaved individual in the back is clearing off another large bowl of punch. So that's 6 guys that are now working on their second bowl of what is mostly probably whiskey. And if you've ever tried 18th century punch, it takes a little bit of getting used to. I'm not really a big mixed drink with a lot of booze drinker. But yeah, it's a little harsh, especially when you consider the level of hard liquors at the time. Not as much distillation, a lot more impurities, which is one of the reasons why they mixed it with different things to make it taste better.
That was served cold, room temperature?
I'm sorry?
Was that served room temperature or hot?
Oh, there were different types of punches. There were hot punches, there were room temperature punches, there were chilled punches. There were so many different versions. They really start off in the late 17th century and go into the 19th century, and then eventually evolve into the single cocktail that people started having. And also the size of the bowls varied in the punch bowls as being quite large, but actually they could vary from an individual serving to those ginormous. And these are some of the punch bowl fragments that we've got from Ferry Farm. These are Chinese export porcelain, very highly decorated, very fashionable. So this means that Mary is making punches, serving them, and in basically the most expensive ware that she could afford. But this is my absolute favorite. This is my favorite artifact of all at Ferry Farm. And this is a sneaker-sized punch bowl. So the way this worked is, I don't know why it's called sneaker, but it would be about yay big. And you would mix the punch in the bowl and then sip it and hand it to the next person because they had no idea how diseases were transmitted. But it's okay because it was mostly hard alcohol. So this is our sneaker-sized punch bowl, and we love it especially because it's got cherries on it, and Ferry Farm has a cherry treatment. And this is what the bowl would look like. Same size and everything. And I'm sorry this is depicted upside down. We can't turn it right side up and take a picture of it. It's too delicate. What was also really cool about this punch bowl is that at some point it broke, like they all do. That's why we find it archaeologically. But in this case, Mary Washington made the decision to have it mended. So she had one of her enslaved individuals glue it together. She could have opted to have it repaired professionally here in town. There was a mender in town, we know that. Instead, she chose to have it glued together. So whenever I first started looking at this bowl 6.5 years ago, I saw residue on it. It's very obvious right here. You can see this brown goop that extends across these 4 sherds. And if you look really carefully, you can actually see brush strokes in it. It's especially apparent microscopically. So what we did is we took samples of this, sent it to Eastern Michigan University, and had them analyze it using mass spectrometry. And what they came back with was that it was probably a cheese glue, which sounds a bit weird, but I've been talking about a lot of weird things today. So, you know. And cheese glue is a pretty basic 18th century glue that involved a hard cheese like Parmesan today, egg whites, and quicklime. And the proteins in the egg whites and the cheese acted as a binder, and the quicklime acted as a hardener. And we've actually made our own cheese glues at Ferry Farm and tried mending vessels with it. And what we determined was that there was absolutely no way that the mended punch bowl here would have been able to hold a liquid. So the cool thing about that is that I've been emphasizing over and over and over again Mary Washington's, you know, desire to reflect this air of refinement. But in some cases, it wasn't just the fact that you could serve punch out of a bowl like this. It was just knowing that you owned it. Because after she repaired it, it was just ornamental. It had no practical purpose whatsoever except for to sit on a shelf so that people that walked into her house could see, oh, she owns that punch bowl. And even though this is a creamware punch bowl, it's not porcelain, it's not even stoneware. It's a pretty low-fired ceramic. It's not that expensive, but see how highly decorated it is? It was very fashionable at the time. Whenever she owned this, this type of ware had just come out. So it's high fashionability, even though relatively low cost compared to porcelains. So it was still important that she be seen owning this bowl. And it probably filled out a china cabinet, or like, you know, we've done probably multiple times. You break something you really like, you glue it back together, and then kind of turn the crack to the wall so nobody can see what you've done. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. So she's projecting this air of refinement while at the same time clearly being very thrifty. I mean, she's a widow with 5 kids and a reduced income. She's doing a really good job at showing refinement at the same time, like managing a budget. All right, that's all I've got. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions that any of you have. This has been awesome. And you know, feel free to go home and make yourself a cocktail. I know I will. Yes.
With water, realizing that water could be very dangerous to drink, what would they have drunk water out of?
So water really doesn't factor much into the colonial diet, straight water. Whenever colonists first got here, they were absolutely amazed by the amount of fresh water that was in abundance everywhere, and they ruined that pretty quickly. So water supplies got polluted pretty fast. Spring water was something that they would drink, something that trickled out of a mountainside. They knew that was safe for the most part. Also, something that became really popular was mineral water. So if the water had a strong sulfur smell to it, it was considered healthy for you. So if they were drinking waters, it was usually from a spring, and a lot of times it was a mineral water, which had just a lot of stuff in it too.
What would they use
to drink out of?
Yeah.
Probably an all-purpose tumbler, or the same Bellarmine, you know, jug, something like that. You know, a large vessel. Yes.
Was there any social distinction in what women drank as opposed to the men? Were there drinks that were inappropriate for ladies?
Yes, that's a very good question.
Can you say anything about that?
Wine was appropriate for women. Syllabubs, flip, hard alcohol, not appropriate for women. That is a totally adult, white male drink to have. Same with things like, well, I didn't talk about Applejack, but that was something that the colonists produced. I don't know if anybody here has ever heard of that. If you take cider and you freeze it repeatedly and skim off the ice crystals, you increase the alcohol content of the cider every time you do that, but all the impurities are still in there because it's not distillation. So you end up with this like brutish older brother of cider that will give you a splitting headache, but you know, probably feel pretty good, at least initially. So anything that was high ABV. Wine is still good for women, but not after dinner. During dinner, yes. After dinner, the men would retire, usually to a parlor and play games and drink. So, and then, you know, the party would go from there.
Was alcohol permitted to the enslaved community, even in small quantities?
Usually not. No, that isn't to say that they didn't drink it, but it wasn't something that the owners of the slaves would willingly give the enslaved people, because it was all about, you know, control, and you know, we tend to lose control when we drink too much. That was a very good question. Yeah.
Where would they have gotten the water for the tea?
Oh, the Washingtons, you mean?
Yeah.
There was a spring nearby. You've seen it. It's full of iron. It smells like sulfur. It would not be my first option, but the Rappahannock, they didn't have a well. There was no well that we found, and that's not unusual because the enslaved would be able to fetch them water. But also, when you think about it, our ideals for water are much higher now than in the 18th century. So a little bit of cloudiness, not really a big deal. So I would say probably the Rappahannock, which may not have been his money then. I'm not really sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
From what I've come to understand, it was quite common to have a distillery in your own home.
Yes.
And whether it's in your cellar or somewhere else, is there any evidence of that for the Washingtons, or were they only drinking like wines and other imported things, not things that they would make on site?
We don't have any evidence for a distillery on site, do we?
Not that I know.
No, but at Mount Vernon, absolutely. You know, he had one of the biggest distilleries in the country. And he tried his the Mount Vernon whiskey. I've heard it's harsh. Very expensive too.
It's not
but,
good. I had it this weekend.
Thank you, sir. But they almost certainly would have been making cider on site. You know, that's something that you made in-house for the most part, unless you lived in the city and you didn't have the land to grow the apples. You know, you would be making it yourself because it's a fairly simple operation. Yes.
Is there a difference between the alcohol consumption, the type of alcohol consumed between the New England and Mid-Atlantic and, say, Virginia?
Well, if you can believe it, the New Englanders were drinking even more cider. They have grape orchards. Also, they were drinking molasses-based drinks.
So rums.
Yes, they were distilling their own molasses because they had a lot of it. They were also using sugars from maple syrup because they had access to it. So I mean, basically, all you need to make alcohol is liquid and sugar and some yeast, either introduced or naturally occurring. So any kind of sugars they had, and they had more molasses and maple syrup. I mean, if you go to like Europe, there are beech trees, and they're getting beech syrup and making alcohol out of that. So it's like whatever you got. Yes.
I've read that one of the reasons these colonial cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, they had so many taverns was that they would prefer to have beer, which they felt was safer than actually drinking water. True?
Yeah, and taverns were meeting places for men. So you could go there, and that's why a lot of the meetings for the revolution were in taverns and things like that. You get together, you've had a meeting of the minds and a little bit to drink, and all of a sudden, let's have a war.
And so the notion of beer for breakfast, a wheat beer for breakfast, is that?
Absolutely. In fact, beer was a breakfast thing. It was also an all-day thing. But John Adams, who considered himself a teetotaler, he also wrote that he would start every single morning with a jug, not a cup, a jug of strong cider. And he did not consider himself an imbiber of alcohol because cider and beer weren't considered drinking. It was just, what you drank all day long. You definitely started your breakfast with either an ale or a cider. And it was also considered nutrition. I mean, more than hydration, these were calories that you had, preserved over the winter. And so this is nutrition that you need if you're going to be working a lot during the day. So, I mean, that's the way chocolate was considered. Any alcoholic beverage was also fell into the nutrition category, so it's good for you, right? Yes?
In those days, did they flavor beer like we do today, or is that a relatively recent concept?
Yeah, Ben Franklin brewed a spruce beer, and that had spruce tips in it, which gave it a piney taste, and you can get that at the City Tavern in Philadelphia, or the Yards Brewing Company makes it as well, and they make a number of different colonial beverages. But that's the big one. I can think of juniper berries, also, again, same piney flavor, but nothing like cherries and, you know, cardamom and, let's see, orange, and, you know, wasn't quite that advanced.
Do you know Ben Franklin's favorite quote about beer? Beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy.
Yes. All right, any other questions? Okey-dokey. Oh.
So we have literature in the back, programs that are coming up at Kenmore's Ferry Farm. So if you have a chance to go back and look at those, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Oh.